There will be a pen up here. There is a pen up here. It's amazing the things I can do. With enough luck, I can do all kinds of things. So, as mentioned, tonight we're going to take on the daunting task of finishing our Old Testament portion of our journey. And as I said, we already have begun the New Testament portion since the beginning of the year, because anything that we would have gotten into from this point on is pretty much exactly what we started with this Life of Christ study. So we'll just consider that the beginning of the next part, and this will be the end of our journey, and then we'll be picking up our Life of Christ study in all of our meetings. In one way or another, it'll be pertaining to the Life of Christ study. Which means we're back in the book of Ezra tonight to start, at least. Chapter 7 of Ezra is really Ezra's portion of the book of Ezra. Ezra seems to be the writer of the whole book, but as I've said, the first 6 chapters are about the first return of the Jews from Babylonia to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel. Chapter 7 through 10 is the second return under Ezra, and then Nehemiah is the third return under the leader Nehemiah. So this Malachi, I forgot to mention, Malachi falls in between this period too, so we'll be covering Malachi as well as briefly as we can, because he has some pretty powerful things that are extremely relevant to the ending of the Old Testament narrative, because the timing of Malachi, estimated timing, is very similar to Nehemiah. So this section of the first 2 chapters of Ezra, there it goes, is really 3 parts, told in 3 parts. We have a third-person narrative of Ezra's being permitted to go back to Jerusalem. Then we have the king's letter that is allowing Ezra to go, and then we have a first-person account of Ezra, by Ezra, of his trip to Jerusalem. So that's chapter 7 and 8. And it says that in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, the first, 458 BC, which is approximately 60 years after Zerubbabel's group, a scribe named Ezra is allowed to lead a second group of Jews back to Jerusalem. So the first group, again, under Zerubbabel. Now we have a second group that's allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And Ezra's genealogy is traced back 16 generations, all the way back to Aaron, the chief priest, it says, verse 5. And it says, he was a scribe, but he wasn't just any scribe. He was one that was skilled in the law of Moses and that Jehovah, the God of Israel, had given. Ezra was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that Jehovah, the God of Israel, had given. And he is going to play a big role. He was a very important character at this time, and really in all the history of Israel, but especially at this time. But in all the Old Testament, in all the history, all the periods of their history and different phases, Ezra is one of the most admirable and really men that we should imitate because of his zeal for bringing things back to a point, a place that they should be. And Nehemiah did the exact same thing after him. But Ezra really crisscrosses with Nehemiah some too. They share some time together. So, verse 10 of chapter 7, here's that really a sermon unto itself. Ezra, why did Ezra do all the things that he did? That he hasn't done yet, but that we're about to learn about. Verse 10 is the key. For Ezra, had set his heart, I'd call that number one. That alone is number one. He had set his heart to study the law of Jehovah, to do it, and to teach it. 4 points right there. He set his heart to study the law of Jehovah, to do the law of Jehovah, and to teach the law of Jehovah. You can't get any better than that if you're a preacher or a teacher who's looking for a sermon or a lesson. Right there it is. Set his heart, study the law, do the law, teach the law. And he proved that. Everything else that's in the book of Ezra is pretty much an extension of that verse right there. It shows that that's exactly what he had in mind to do. So upon arriving, I said 60 years after the temple, after the first group returned. I should have said 80 years. It's about 60 years after the temple was finished. So, excuse me, 60 years after the temple was finished, somewhere around that 60-year period, about 80 years, a little less than 80 years after the first group, Ezra finds the people had already been intermarrying with the pagans of the land. Again, already. Now we might think 60 years or so since the temple was done. 60 years might, from one perspective, seem like a long time. But in another way, it's not a very long time at all. Especially in this context when they had finally gotten back to Jerusalem and they've rebuilt the temple. This is big time stuff for them religiously and spiritually. 70 years they were gone, 70 plus years. If you add the 80, these particular people were gone for double that without being able to partake in this stuff, without having a temple. Now the temple's done, and already, after 60 years from the completion of that temple, they've already started marrying the pagans. One of the things that God explicitly said, do not do, because they'll lead you away from me. This is what Ezra finds when he gets there, that all these people, 8 nations are listed: Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. In chapter 9, it's very similar to the list of the nations that dwelt there before they even conquered Canaan. So it's kind of like deja vu. It's repeating, history repeating itself. And in response to this discovery, it says that Ezra says, "As soon as I heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak and pulled my hair from my head and beard," ouch, "and sat down confounded until the evening sacrifice." That's Ezra 9 verses 3 and 4. So he's devastated. This is terrible. He tore his garment. That was a common way to communicate grief. Sounds weird to us. It would be weird if somebody in our culture did it. But to them, that is just an outward sign of inward anguish and grief. So, and same thing with pulling the hair from the head and the beard. And he sits down confounded. That's what the old ASV says. I kind of like that translation. Sat down confounded until the evening sacrifice. He didn't know what to do. But he knew who would know what to do. And God is never far from Ezra's mind and heart. But what we read in verse 4 then is that all those who trembled at the words of God gathered around Ezra. I love that terminology, that language. All who trembled at the words of the God of Israel gathered around Ezra. There were a lot of people there that did not gather around Ezra, obviously. But who did? The ones who trembled at the words of God. We need to make sure that we're those people. We need to be people that tremble at the words of God. The majority of the world does not. But we should. Because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, that's why they were gathering around Ezra. They too shared Ezra's hurt, his grief over the state of their nation and people. So here we have a group of faithful. There's a special R word that we could use to refer to these people. The remnant. Now the people that came back to Jerusalem are a remnant in a way, aren't they? They're the remnant that survived and that came back. But now we have a remnant among the remnant. And that's how it always was in Israel. There was a remnant of faithful in the midst of the majority who were unfaithful. Faithless, as he puts it here. Because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, all who trembled at the words of God gathered around him. Now, why would they do that? Why would they all be grieving about this? Why did they go to captivity in the first place? Or why did they get the oppressor to hound them, if you will, in the first place? They had been faithless. Their faithlessness got them in trouble. And then their further faithlessness got them in exile. Well, now they're back, and these people look around among their people, and all they see is faithlessness. No wonder they're grieving, because it's almost like a helpless feeling. What are we going to do? We're doomed again. I mean, we can't even stay faithful as a nation for this long. We have no hope. And by the way, notice verse 9 of Ezra 9 says, when Ezra prays to God, that was his decision, his resolution. I'm going to pray. That's a pretty good resolution, pretty good reaction. And in that prayer about their sinfulness, he says, we are slaves. Did you catch that? We are slaves. I thought they'd just been freed. Or had they? No, they hadn't. They were still slaves. He says it again later in the verse, the next sentence. Our God has not forsaken us in our slavery. They were still slaves of Persia. They were just slaves in a different place. They weren't slaves in the territory of Persia anymore. They were slaves in their own city, which was still a territory of Persia, but at least it was their own place. Their slavery, they weren't freed. Their chains weren't broken completely. They were just allowed to go to a different place that was still under the umbrella of Persia. So I point that out to again show the pattern here is that they never regained their independence. They never became a kingdom again. They never became an independent nation again. But they were taken as Babylonian slaves. Now they were Persian slaves. They would soon become Greek slaves. And then they would be Roman slaves by the time Jesus came to the earth. They were slaves of Rome. And then they were finally, the iron fist of Rome squished them with the final blow by the Romans. So Ezra at least understood that they were still slaves, even now. But here's the most powerful part of his prayer. He says, and after all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? That's verses 13 and 14. It's a rhetorical question. Shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice all these abominations for which you punished us? What's the answer? No, we shall not. But they were. He says, O Jehovah, you are just. Behold, we are before you in our guilt, for none can stand before you because of this. He understood that they were at the brink of destruction again, all over again. God had forgiven them, had freed them, at least from living in exile and captivity, and now here they are full circle again. It just does, that cycle will not be broken. And finally, the people came and confessed to Ezra, and they took care of their faithlessness. In the immediate sense of their marriages that should not have been created in the first place by putting those wives away and vowing that they would not do that again. And it's at this time that Malachi, God raises up Malachi, the last prophet of this era. I guess we could call him the last prophet of the Old Testament because he was the last prophet of the Old Testament, as we call it. But the Old Covenant, really, I guess that would go to John the Baptizer to be the last prophet of the Old Covenant, unless you count Jesus in there as one of them, although I'm not sure if he would fall in that same category. But Malachi was at least the last prophet of this era. And this good scribe Ezra is there teaching the people. So why in the world would God need to call a prophet like Malachi? Well, because in Israel at this time, he found a perverted priesthood and a faithless people. He found these faithless people, just like Ezra did, but also a perverted priesthood. And they were offering these pathetic offerings of the sick and the lame and the blind. That's Malachi 1, 6 through 14, and 3, 6 through 12. And he said things like this: "Oh, that there were one among you who would shut the doors, that you might not kindle fire on my altar in vain. I have no pleasure in you, says Jehovah of hosts, and I will not accept an offering from your hand." That's how God felt about Israel already at this time. At the time when it should have been so happy, all faithfulness, all joy and submission and humility to the Lord, this is what God sees. Yes?
But I think that's the way He has always felt and always will feel. He will not accept our leftovers. In other words, you see, people get things for themselves and they want the best. But when it comes to the Lord, well, they cheap out.
That's where the justification comes in. Yeah.
Right. And it always reminds me of Judas. It's like, well, that money could have been spent on something other than anointing the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just don't understand how people think they can get less.
But people want to do what people want to do. They don't want to have somebody tell them what to do and how to do it, when to do it, and what not to do. They like to have free reign.
Yeah, we're not told why they offered the sick and lame and blind, but they did for some reason. And it may be that they were justifying, like humans tend to do. What does God need with a sheep? And even if He did need the sheep, He doesn't even get the sheep, does He? He's telling us to kill the sheep and then burn the sheep. And then the priests eat the sheep. Well, I'm no expert, but I would expect that a sheep that is perfectly healthy is going to taste the same as a sheep with a broken leg. I don't know. I've never eaten sheep. But, what's the difference? And especially, what does God care about whether the sheep looks like this or that? That's one way they could have justified it. They certainly were doing something to justify it, or else they wouldn't have had the courage to spit in God's face like this, which is pretty much what He's saying they were doing. Yeah.
Right. Their disobedience, He viewed as despising His name.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sin is, I heard Dan Winkler once say, that people don't realize doing what you want to do instead of what God says is like shaking your fist at Him and being high-handed, going, well, I'll do what I want.
Yeah.
That's not acceptable.
That's the distinction is made in the law about sinning with a high hand, and it's believed that's what it is referencing is, you're saying, God, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do this. I know what you said, but I'm not going to do it anyway. As opposed to accidentally or in a moment of weakness, you do something that God said don't do, you are deliberately not doing what God said or doing what He said not to do. So that's exactly what they were doing here. There's just no getting around it. So He says, from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name will be great among the nations. And what's that other synonym for nations? The Gentiles. Because from a Jewish perspective, the nations is always referring to every other nation besides Israel. which would be Gentiles. And in every place incense will be offered to my name, and a pure offering. For my name will be great among the nations, says Jehovah of hosts. But you profane it when you say that the Lord's table is polluted, and its fruit, that is, its food, may be despised. And then he says, you say, what a weariness it is, and you snort at it, says Jehovah of hosts. You bring what has been taken by violence, or is lame or sick. You bring this as an offering. Shall I accept that from your hand, says Jehovah? Cursed be the cheat who has a male in his flock and vows it, and yet sacrifices to the Lord what is blemished. Then he goes on in a couple chapters, in chapter 3, he says, for from the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. Return to me, and I will return to you, says Jehovah of hosts. And by the way, the verse right before that is when he says, for I, Jehovah, do not change. I change not. And he says, from the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes, you haven't kept them, but if you'll return to me, I'll return to you. He says, will a man rob God? Yet you are robbing me in your tithes and contributions. And then he says, one of the most important things of this book, you are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. You are cursed with a curse. Remember, this is getting very close to the very last words that God spoke to Israel until John the Baptizer. You remember one of the things that John the Baptizer said to the Jews that came out to him, something about an axe lying at the root of the tree? He said, even now the axe is lying at the root of the tree. What happens if you take an axe to the root of a tree? That tree will go and it won't come back. So John, here, God is already 450 or so years, maybe closer to 500 years before that, God already says, this whole nation is cursed with a curse because they will not obey Him. So, in chapter 4 then, the last message that He sends them, for behold, the day is coming. No, excuse me. Before we get to that part. Verses 16 through 18. Then those who feared Jehovah spoke with one another. The Lord Jehovah paid attention and heard them, and a book of remembrance was written before Him of those who feared Jehovah and esteemed His name. They shall be mine, says Jehovah of hosts, in the day when I make up my treasured possession, and I will spare them as a man spares his son. What kind of son? Who serves him. Then once more you shall see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked, between one who serves God and one who does not serve Him. And by the way, that is the distinction between the good and the evil of the world in all times. The one who serves Jehovah, the one who does not serve Jehovah. That's who's good versus who is evil in every single case and every single period of history of the world. Mm-hmm.
Did he begin in chapter 3 talking about Jesus coming? And that now he's talking about the end of time, what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Right?
It seems. It would definitely apply to that, yeah.
Because it only has a messenger is sent.
Yeah.
And there's only one that has the authority to do all this.
Yep. And then he goes back to that here in chapter 4. So even now, you see God's already looking forward to this culmination or fulfillment of His great plan. You can tell by the words that He's saying and the spirit of these words that He's already done with them as a nation. He's still going to preserve them so that what He's prophesying here in chapters 3 and 4 will come about. But as far as they are concerned, He's done with them. And what better way to show them that than to not speak to them for 450 years? You know, you ever heard of the silent treatment? Anybody ever give you the silent treatment before? I guarantee they've never given it to you for 450 years. No matter how hard they try, they're not going to be able to. But if somebody could, that would really show you that something is wrong with this relationship. 450-year silent treatment. God, and yet He was busy in all that time, just not with them, but in preparing the way for the coming of this messenger and the one that He would be heralding. So He says, behold, the day is coming, burning like an oven, when all the arrogant and all evildoers will be stubble. The day that is coming shall set them ablaze, says Jehovah of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch. Even now the axe lies at the root of the trees. But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall rise, with healing in its wings. You shall go out leaping like calves from the stall. You shall tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day when I act, says Jehovah of hosts. Remember the law of my servant Moses, the statutes and rules that I commanded him. Interesting. One of the last things He tells them is remember the law I gave to Moses all the way back at Mount Sinai. Look back. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of Jehovah comes. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the land with a decree of utter destruction. Now, as far as prophets are concerned, that's the last word God had for His people. Nehemiah falls, according to most estimations, after Malachi, at least very close to the same period. But Nehemiah isn't ever given a new message from God, but he's just working with the messages that God has already given. But notice how similar Malachi 3:16 through 18 is, that concept in verse 16, those who fear Jehovah, to those in Ezra who trembled at the words of Jehovah. See, it's the same people. There was a group of faithful Israelites that were looking for, serving Jehovah and looking for the coming of the one who would come to make everything right, everything new. And God very specifically says in this case, they shall be mine. I will spare them. Then you'll see the distinction between the righteous and the wicked. He's not talking about all peoples. He's talking about in His own people. You'll see between the one who serves God and the one who does not serve Him. And when that day comes, the arrogant and evildoers among my people will be like stubble. But you who fear my name, it'll be healing. The sun's going to rise and it's going to burn the evil people. But it'll heal the people who fear my name. And isn't that exactly what happened when Jesus came? How did the people who resisted God's word, God's truth, respond to Jesus? Positively or negatively? Very negatively, and to the point where it brought about their destruction. Spiritually, sadly, and even physically. Mm-hmm.
But, okay, when He says, remember the law of my servant Moses, when you read Deuteronomy, a great deal of that is preached again by Jesus. Now, it uses the word son, S-U-N,
Mm-hmm.
but the Word of God offers healing and restoration to Him. If you reject that, then that's when you're lost. So it's how you respond to Jesus is what He's talking about. He's got all the light, all the power. You take this healing, you're good. You reject this healing, you're done for.
Yep. It's the same source, but it will affect you differently. It'll affect different people in different ways. It'll either consume them or it will heal them. It will hurt. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, two-edged sword. It cuts both ways, and we should let it pierce our heart in a way that will rebuild our heart and our minds and our souls even. But it could pierce our heart in the sense of killing us. And God distinguishes in that way there at the end of Malachi. The last thing He has for them to say. Now, very quickly, the purpose of Nehemiah is pretty much exactly stated in the opening 3 verses. It says, "Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa the citadel," we're back in Susa, still back in Susa again, rather than Jerusalem, "that Hanani, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire." That sets up the rest of this book. A third group is about to come back to Jerusalem. And Nehemiah is going to be the leader of this group. And we learned that Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. He was going to be in the presence of the king often. And on one fateful occasion, if we want to call it that, he was visibly sad and downcast in the king's presence, so that he asked what was wrong. "What's going on? What's wrong? Are you sick?" He says, "You're not sick. This is some sort of, pain of the heart or whatever, grief of the heart." And he says, "Well, why shouldn't I be sad? Seeing that, what's happened to my people over there, and the place of my father's graves, it lies in ruins." And the king understood that he, or at least perceived, he was wanting to ask for something. I don't know if he was, but he thought he was. So he said, "Okay, what do you want? I see where this is going. What do you want?" And I love how it says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven." And I'm not so sure that he fell down right in front of the king and started praying. But maybe just inside, real quick, just a quick prayer can be as powerful as, a long one. In a situation like this, it may have just been a very quick, "Almighty God, help me." God knows what people need, so God would have understood that, even if nobody else would have. But at any rate, he asked to be allowed to go to Judah. "Send me to Judah, that I may rebuild it." So Zerubbabel goes back, and the temple is rebuilt. Now, but the walls were never rebuilt. Now Nehemiah is going to go back and help rebuild the walls, just like Zerubbabel went back and helped rebuild the temple. So, like Zerubbabel went back and rebuilt the temple. So, as it goes on, that's really Nehemiah 1 and 2 right there. The third group returns under the leadership of Nehemiah, and he first begins the structural restorations, spiritual restorations, political restorations, chapters 3 through 7, about 444 BC. But these workers did not waste any time. They started building the wall, started with the sheep gate. Don't know which one that was, but it was one of them. All manner of persons were involved in and dedicated to this work. And why was that? Why is this the way that things were? That they were so quick to build it, they started it, there seems to be no hesitation. What's the key? I'll give you a hint. The key's in verse 6 and it's on the screen. The people had a mind to work. Isn't that the first step? At least the first step to when the work actually starts to be done. There's planning stages and all this, but until people have a mind to work, the work is not going to be able to start. And if it does start, it's not going to be very effective. They learned that with the temple situation. They started, then as soon as somebody said, "Hey, we don't like you doing that," they said, "Okay, well, we tried." And then they didn't get going again for like 16 years or something. So at least 2 years they didn't even start again. But here different situation under Nehemiah. But now it's starting to look like the temple situation again, because we meet some villains here. Tobiah being one of the main ones. I don't even know how to say the other guy's name, so I'll just leave it alone. But it says, they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem. So Nehemiah says, we prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night. That's an interesting idea, isn't it? We prayed to God, but they also set a guard. We can't rely on God to do literally everything for us, but we have to do our part too. Nehemiah was encouraging all this time. He was building them up as they were building the wall up, and we get this awesome picture of where is it? Half of my servants worked on construction, half held the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. So we labored at the work. Half of them held spears from the break of dawn until the stars came out. And so the wall was finished in 52 days. I get the impression that was quick, relatively speaking. 52 days. And all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem. That would be good for anybody, to fall greatly in their own esteem. For they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God. Isn't that powerful? The nations around them were afraid. They perceived, because of what they saw in these people, that they were succeeding and growing and getting this work done because their God was helping them. They saw God, the power and help of a God in them. And they were just finishing to build the walls. And in chapters 8 through 12, then, he's going to go in with these religious reforms. And it's some of the most encouraging and uplifting chapters we can read anywhere, because we have Ezra here, who brings the law. Says, all the people gathered, chapter 8, as one man into the square before the water gate, and they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that Jehovah had commanded Israel. So Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, both men and women, and all who could understand what they heard, on the first day of the 7th month. And he read from it, facing the square before the water gate, from early morning until midday, in the presence of the men and the women and those who could understand. And the ears of all the people were attentive to the book of the law. And Ezra the scribe stood on a wooden platform that they had made for the purpose. Verse 5 says, and Ezra opened the book in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. And he opened it, and as he opened it, all the people stood. Verse 8 says, they read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. They were there, what was it, from early morning until midday, hearing Ezra read from the book of the law. And we can't sit here for an hour, not even when somebody's reading from the book of the law. I don't know if we could get through that. Yep.
The phrase, all those who could understand, isn't that equal to what we refer to as the age of accountability? In other words, babies and people who couldn't understand what the law was saying
Yeah.
are not responsible.
Yeah, I think there is definitely that idea in there. But it's probably younger people than we would think in this group. Anybody that could understand what they were saying, really, and not language-wise, but just, mental capacity-wise, like you said. But then it also says that they went further to help the people understand what was being said. So there was a little bit of help in addition to just reading from it. But as the people were hearing this, it says they were weeping. The people wept as they heard the words of the law. Sort of like when Josiah came to the throne and found the book of the law. And they started celebrating the Feast of Booths again. And Nehemiah 12 really ends with this great picture of everything seems to be exactly where it should be. It's all coming back together. The people have repented. They're all on the same page. And he's getting the law, just like Josiah did, getting everything right back where God and through the law said it should be. And then he gets the temple back to the right order and sets the officials back over. And then he goes back to Susa. Because it wasn't an indefinite thing, but he had to go back. And that's chapter 12. In chapter 13, as we close here, the last part, chapter 13 is, believed to be about a year later, after chapter 12. And he comes back after a time. And he comes back to see exactly what Ezra came back to see all those years before. The people are again, they've got it all messed up. So everything we just looked at from Malachi, that kind of thing was happening again. They had the temple all out of sorts. They were marrying with the pagans again. They even, it says, that Elisha the priest prepared for Tobiah. Remember who Tobiah was? We didn't really talk much about him, but I mentioned his name. He's one of the main, the villains who tried to make them stop, tried to put an end to it. Now he's got his bedroom, a room of his own in the temple. The place where they used to put the tithes, they said, hey, let's clean out those tithes and we'll make this Tobiah's room. That's how bad it had gotten. And we see a little bit of reason is because it was those who were related to him. You know how they got related to him? Marrying the people of the land. And it says, while this was taking place, and this is where Nehemiah says he wasn't in Jerusalem. He had gone back. He gets permission to come back, and he is very angry. Get a load of this. He gets back, he says, I was very angry. I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers. And I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense. I also found the portions that the Levites had not been given to them as they were supposed to through the law, according to the law. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And this has always been one of my favorite verses because that question I think could be asked today. If God raised up a prophet again, I think that is the message he would have. Why is the house of God forsaken? All you have to do is look around and you'll see that is the question that the church would need to be asked today. So he gathers all these people together. He confronted them. Now here's a real picture to keep in your mind. I confronted them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair. That's a sermon you'll never forget if you had to live through it. I won't do that to anybody. But he made them make an oath because of this intermarrying. It says, one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Elisha the high priest, was the son-in-law of Sanballat, or whatever, however you say his name, the Horonite. So I chased him from me. He ran him away. Don't you make me come after you. And finally Nehemiah says, remember me. So here, this is all, I say all this to say he got everything back in order as much as he could again. He says, remember me, O my God, for good. And this is the end of the Old Testament chronologically, even though Malachi is the end of it as far as the book order and God's words from prophets. Remember me, O my God, for good. But we don't have a very good idea and impression of Israel's condition because, like I said, he was gone for a year and he came back and everything that he did was already all turned upside down. So we don't have the confidence that it's going to be any better in the next year. And that goes back to God saying, look, you are cursed with a curse. But I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet. I'm sending you my messenger. And he's going to come and he's going to set the hearts of the fathers to the children. And he's going to do all these things. The Son of Righteousness will come with healing in its wings. So we get these pictures of the end of the Old Testament with Malachi's ministry and Nehemiah's final reforms. And the people seem more bent on destruction than ever before. But God again comforts the remnant, lets them know who to look for next. Elijah. And for 450 years, the Jews will be falsely looking for somebody to come and restore their earthly kingdom. And so the thought that we're left with is, as Jesus said concerning His second coming, we can apply it to His first coming. When the Son of Man comes, will He find faith? That is the question that is left hanging at the end of the Old Testament. And sadly, we know from the New Testament, when He came, He did not find very much faith in Israel, did He? He did find faith in a lot of Gentiles, and He said, even among Israel I haven't found this kind of faith. So that's how the Old Testament ends, and the New Testament makes pretty clear that God had this new era that was coming in, this new covenant, a new kingdom, a new Lord, a new everything. And it would come through His messenger, His Son, Jesus Christ. And that's what we've been starting to study lately, and that's what we're going to keep studying. So the unfolding of this plan after that 450 years, we've already seen it start to unfold. And we've been living in it our whole lives. But these people would have needed to look for that and to stay faithful. Remember the law of my servant Moses. And look for Elijah the prophet, which Jesus said was John the Baptizer. And John said was himself. He said himself. Any thoughts, comments? Went over a little bit, but we got her done.
It's kind of scary if we're as stupid as they are. It seems like it's the trend.
Yeah.
God is that way.
Yeah, we talk about them and
We're
then,
next.
yeah. We might be hard on them and then we look in the mirror and like to use Katana's words, we're just as stupid as they were. Like,
Seems that way.
so that, in a way, that makes us even more stupid.
Because we have education.
Yeah, we have their example. Like Paul said, these things were written so we won't do what they did, and yet here we are doing what they did. So what does that say about us? But learn the lesson, at least that they learned before it's too late, that if we will return to God, He'll return to us every time. But we have to truly return to Him.